and the University of Bergen, and is a visiting faculty at Ashoka University. He read his PhD at the Leiden University Institute for History in 2016. He has authored Islamic Law in Circulation, Shafi texts across the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean, and has also co-edited Malabar in the Indian Ocean World, Cosmopolitanism in the Maritime Historical Region, as well as Islamic law in the Indian Ocean, texts, ideas, and practices. He was a research fellow at the International Institute for Asian Studies and African Studies Center, Dutch Institute in Morocco, and Social Science Research Council, New York. He has published in several peer-reviewed journals such as the Annals, Sciences Socials, Journal of the Economic and Social History of the Orient, Law and History Review, Oxford Journal of Law and Religion, and others. So it is our pleasure, Mahmood, to have you with us today. So welcome once again, and let me hand over the platform to you at this point. Welcome.
All right, thank you so much, Anna, for such a generous introduction. It's a pleasure to talk to you all as part of this series, Mezzaterra, Conversation Science Borders. And I was communicating with Anna on the concept of the series, and it sounds very fascinating, especially as it tries to communicate with scholars from different borders or from different disciplines and so forth. So today's talk also, in a way, is an attempt to engage with different disciplines, even though I primarily come from history background. But within that, I try to engage with different subdisciplines, so to speak. Primarily book history, but also social history, trans-regional history, Indian Ocean history, and so forth. So I have a presentation, a PowerPoint. I'll share it with you first, and then so that some of the terms you can follow. I think the host needs to allow me to share my screen.
Yeah, just a second.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's enabled, Mahmood.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, thank you. I believe you can see this, right? If not, in a minute.
Yes. Yeah. It's on.
Yeah, so the talk is like the title, A Library in the Ocean, Premodern Textual Circulations and Citation Regimes. So this is an attempt to look at, or to reconstruct some of the lost libraries, so to speak. Lost libraries of not a particular or of a small place, but libraries that were established as part of a large intercontinental transoceanic exchanges. So how can we construct, like, especially a library of pre-modern period, like let's say medieval period or ancient period, that is completely lost to us? And here, what I try to explore is to, introduce a particular concept or a technique that could be useful, where we can explore that kind of, library. I'll start with a like an overview, so that you can expect what, so you can see what to expect. So I'll start with two anecdotes of a Gujarat vizier in a wrecked ship and a Tunisian Jew in Mangalore. I'll come to the details later, and then I also will explain the interventions or the historiographical interventions that this paper tried to engage. And then I'll come to the age of manuscripts, and then in the larger context of Indian Ocean, and the manuscripts, and then I'll come to the commentary, the commentarial aspect of the manuscripts. And then the question is, how can we explore a library behind a text? And this is something that we can all sort of explore, like in our own work, whenever we read a book, especially if it is an academic scholarly text. There's always a library that is behind, that is invisible, but still visible in its footnotes and so forth. So how can we construct that or imagine that on the basis of what is there in a particular text? And then I'll come to the concluding remarks. So before I continue, there's a very interesting anecdote that I came across when I was reading one biography in the Middle Eastern context in the 16th century. And in that biography, particularly, it had nothing to do with India. But interestingly, I came across this figure called Asaf Khan, who was a vizier or a minister in the Sultanate of Gujarat that had ruled Gujarat for more than a century before it was conquered by the Mughal Empire in 1535. So immediately after the place was conquered, this person, Asaf Khan, he escaped with the harem and the treasure of the Sultan, Gujarat Sultan, to the Middle East. And he traveled in Mecca, Medina, Istanbul, and different places. And he was welcomed in most of these places, primarily because he was very generous from the treasury that he had taken with him from Gujarat. And in the biography that I came across, the Egyptian author or the Egyptian biographer of this Gujarati noble talks in detail the ways in which he, Asaf Khan, engaged with the scholars in the Hijaz in 16th century. And after an interregnum in Gujarat, the Gujarat Sultan was able to reconquer his power by mid 1540s, and he invited Asaf Khan back to Gujarat, and Asaf Khan accepted the invitation, and he was traveling back from Jeddah, present-day Saudi Arabia, to Gujarat, to Surat, on a ship. But unfortunately, his ship was wrecked, and he was cast ashore in Mangalore, present-day Karnataka. And sitting on the port of Mangalore, according to the biographer, Asaf Khan was very sad about all sort of different things that he lost, but most importantly, some of the manuscripts that he was carrying from the Middle East. And as you know, or as we can imagine, books in some instances are very expensive, and for manuscripts it's even more expensive at a time when the paper itself was very limited, and the mechanisms for writing and producing a manuscript was less available. But even more for Asaf Khan, even though he was wealthy to procure as many manuscripts he might have wanted with the treasure, with the kind of wealth he had won, but the knowledge that he had managed to copy down in the manuscripts through interactions with several scholars, all of those were lost off the coast of Mangalore, off the coast of Karnataka in the 1540s. And while he was sitting there as a student of history, what we can reconnect with the same place is this Tunisian Jewish merchant called Abraham Ben Yeju, who had came to Mangalore at least 4 centuries before him, in 12th century. And then also about him, we have some very interesting documents where he was struggling to find a piece of paper so that he could write letters to his colleagues in Aden, in Yemen, as well as in Egypt. And but still, in whatever scraps of papers that he managed to collect, he wrote, without even leaving a margin. he would fill all the information. And then he asked to his colleagues, one of them being like Maimonides or Maimon, one of the most famous medieval Jewish jurist from the Middle East. So he asked for the copies of some of these manuscripts and other things from the place. And it is very interesting, even though they are situated 4 centuries apart, the same place, that is Mangalore, sort of brings together two different people who are, without any potential connections, be still being connected with the ocean and with the, sort of like crave for books and manuscripts of their time. So, what is for me interesting in this whole story is the circulation of books or circulation of manuscripts before the age of print. So, circulation of those who are from history background or those who are interested in the histories of books, we all read books in various ways, but books themselves have a history, right? They have their own biographies as objects. And in Asia and Africa, there are book history as a discipline, a comparatively new field, much developed in the in the context of Europe. But in the context of Asia and Africa, especially for a period before the age of print, we have very little information. Although in the recent times, many scholars have started to explore book histories after the advantage of printing press, printing technology. But as a student, of history, interested in pre-modern period, for the circulation of manuscripts in these places, we have very little information. And even though I say very little information, there are still some important text in the context of Middle East, I must say. And specifically, I am interested in the history of Islam, and therefore, some of these important works by J. Pedersen, French historian, if I remember correctly, and his work called the Arabic Book is one of the classic texts that was originally written in English and then eventually published in 1984 or so, as the translation. And Franz Rosenthal is another scholar who also has written about the writing practices in the Middle East. George Atiyah, another scholar. And recently, Konrad Hischler had published a catalog of a manuscript library from Damascus, 13th century Damascus. And that is a very interesting exercise where he sort of, tries to imagine the kind of, reading culture that must have existed in the 13th century Damascus. So he and his first book on the reading and writing in Damascus also an important contribution in the field. But once we go beyond the Middle East, we have some other, sort of, let's say, fleeting references on the book circulations in some places, whereas some places have more are more privileged in terms of the works that were, especially, let's say, as someone who is also interested in East African and West African history, the recent works by Falun Gong, as well as Shamil Jipi and Suleiman Diane in the context of Timbuktu, the fabled city of Mali. There are works on the places like that, whereas Finbar Flood or Judith Pfeiffer, who has written, and also Zibender Benite, his book on China, have somewhat interesting and detailed information on the trans-regional circulation of books, or the we could say the networks of manuscripts. But primarily, I am interested in the Indian Ocean. Indian Ocean as an area of study, where it was before the aeroplanes became, the most important way of transportation across continents. Indian Ocean was the highway that most people depended for the intercontinental and inter-regional travels. And along those routes, along with the people who traveled as traders, sailors, itinerants, scholars, missionaries, and so forth. Along with them, ideas, texts, commodities, and everything also traveled. Some scholars, in the last, let's say, 5 years or less than 5 years, scholars like Christopher Bell, Joel Blecher, and May Val Ravens have written on some of these manuscript circulations in the Indian Ocean, particularly between South Asia and the Middle East. And Anneke Bang's work on the context of the Swahili coast. Whereas while all these scholars are comparatively very recent, only S.D. Goitin, the stalwart of Geniza Record studies, he seems to be the only person who has written before them, at least briefly, about the circulation of manuscripts in the Indian Ocean. So again, so we can see that while the circulations of the books and manuscripts in the larger Asian African context are still a field that is evolving, and in a way, my contribution, my talk or my paper sort of tries to contribute to these discussions in the field. So, what is the Indian Ocean's manuscripts? I believe you can all hear me well. It is almost like I cannot see. I see only my own slide. So I believe
Yes,
most of
yes,
the
you're
time.
audible.
All right, all right. So uh, so from the larger context of Indian Ocean circulations of manuscripts, what is Indian Ocean manuscripts? And as I mentioned, Indian Ocean was a very important mode of or highway of exchange, an oceanic highway, we could say. And before the 19th century, or at least before the late 19th century. And in the 19th century, Indian Ocean became like a British lake. Before that, often until 16th century, from 9th century to 16th century, Indian Ocean is often dubbed among scholars as an Islamic lake, primarily because of the role that Islamic communities had played in the trans-regional and transoceanic exchanges. And therefore, because of the prominence of Islam, Arabic itself was an important arena or an important player, catalyst in the oceanic world. Whether it is in the Bay of Bengal, Arabian Sea, or and definitely Red Sea region. So in the South and Southeast Asia, Arabic as a language replaced what Sheldon Pollock calls the Sanskrit cosmopolis. So Ronit Ritchie, in her work called Arabic Cosmopolis, argues that after the 13th century, when the Sanskrit cosmopolis sort of gives way to the vernacular cultures, Arabic becomes an important lingua franca in the Indian Ocean. And she explores that in the context of Tamil, Javanese, and Malay literary cultures. And what is within that, what is important is that in the larger Indian Ocean region, Arabic script was used. What Ronit Ritchie looks at is the sort of the Arabic literature that influenced the Tamil literature, the Javanese and Malay literature. But the script itself, the Arabic script itself, was very important in the Indian Ocean littoral, from Eastern Africa, South Africa, to Southeast Asia. Even, let's say, in South Africa, for example, Afrikaans was initially printed and written in Arabic script, right? And similarly, Swahili, Makua, and many other languages, including Tamil, Malayalam, all these languages also were written in Arabic script, as much as in several Southeast Asian languages. And before they were, of course, replaced by, let's say, either the local scripts, such as, like, for example, in Malayalam, some of the local scripts, or the Latin script, which had happened, which had sort of replaced many Arabic script writing practices, such as Swahili, Malay, Bahasa Indonesia, and so forth. All these languages, which were, dependent on the Arabic script until early 20th century, were replaced by, either local scripts or Latin script. And then the printing tradition itself also contributed to that by the 20th century. Even though most of these languages were printed in the mid 19th century onward, were printed in Arabic script itself, including, as I was just mentioning, the Afrikaans, for example. The earliest available text in Afrikaans is a printed text in Arabic script. And similarly, we can say that Tamil, Malay, for example, if we take Malay, the earliest printed text of Malay were printed in Bombay. And these were again printed in the Arabic script before printing press was established in Singapore in the late 19th century. Along with it came the Latin script as well. So for an age before the sort of printing press took over and replaced the and dramatically changed the writing practices, manuscripts in the Indian Ocean context had a shared scriptorial practice, one could say. Okay, as this image appears again, maybe I'll leave it for later. So texts in the Indian Ocean circulated through shared scriptorial as well as linguistic spaces, shared spaces. And Arabic was the prominent language, but not the only one. Persian was equally important from Eastern Africa to Eastern Asia, where people had, and this is something that scholars haven't explored until very recently, 2 years ago, or sorry, 2019, 2 years ago. Three edited volumes came out with the idea of, like, what they call Persian cosmopolis or Persianate world. So Persian, the importance of Persian is also something that being explored more extensively in the Indian Ocean context. While these two languages, sort of in the manuscript producing world, stood as the umbrella languages, there were more other languages which were not necessarily as big as these two languages, but still they were not minor either. So Malay is an important language in the island Southeast Asia. Not only in the island Southeast Asia, even in the mainland Southeast Asia, such as places like Cambodia and Vietnam, people were using Malay as a lingua franca. And Tamil between South and Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, coast, southeastern coast of India, and then Sumatra, that is Indonesia, Malaysia, up to China. Tamil was an important, language that was used and reused by different communities, and Swahili as well in Eastern Africa. So these three languages, we could say, within the larger cosmopolis, these three languages, at least in the Indian Ocean world, formed their own microcosmos of trans-regional communications and trans-regional productions of the manuscript. For example, if we take Swahili, it is spoken in more than 10 countries in Eastern Africa, right? And it continues to be used. And then we have, like, interestingly, one of the earliest manuscripts in Swahili, again written in Arabic, has survived and continues to survive in Goa, in India. And that is, if that is from 18th century, from 19th century and 20th century, despite of the prominence of the printing press, the language and the manuscripts sort of continued to be produced in Kenya, in Zanzibar, in Tanzania, Somalia, and so forth. And besides these, like, Cosmopolis and Microcosmos, there were several other minor languages which also couched the larger characteristics of the oceanic, productions or oceanic productions of manuscripts. And these can be like any number of different languages, whether Gujarati, Bengali, or Buginese or Maguindanao and so forth. So all these languages, how did they, sort of couch the oceanic nature into them? Mostly through the cultures of translations of various categories, whether the commendarial translations, interlinear translations, that is like, writing translations between a text in, let's say, in Arabic. So you would write like, something in Malayalam or, Tamil, or you would write a commentary. So instead of translating the text, you comment on that. And this is, or of course, writing marginalia. And these, like, also make the, Indian Ocean manuscript tradition something that is very hybrid and organic, something that changes over time. And it's not necessarily, of course, it had one author, or many of these manuscripts had one author, but these were like, thanks to the specific advantages of the manuscript culture, they were organic in the sense that they were often reworked and commended, and as much as they were circulated in the region. So from there, once we come solely to the solid question of libraries, to what extent we have the libraries from this sort of like very interesting, diverse intermixtures of languages. How many libraries have existed? How many libraries have survived? And this is a question, of course, hard to answer directly. But as we saw in the case of like, many libraries were in circulation, right? As we saw in the case of Asaf Khan, who was, trying to take with him a library from Mecca to Gujarat via Mangalore. And his case, of course, it's a failed case, but represents a larger phenomenon in which people were trying to mobilize books across borders. And one very interesting case, interesting story comes from, not story, case, comes from South Sulawesi in eastern Indonesia. Karang Patinggalawang, who was the Sultan or the ruler of Makassar for almost 15 years. And his library, he was like, of course, a Sulawesi or a Makassari person, but he spoke the local language, Makassaris, as well as Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch. And he demanded, or he requested, or he tried to establish a library with books from all these places, along with, of course, Arabic and the local Malay traditions. And his library, one of the a Jesuit missionary, Alexander the Rhodes, who visited the place in the mid 17th century, says that immediately after his death, says that his library excited the admiration of visitors even after his death. And that library, as I would say, is one of the libraries that had similarly existed in other places, like either royal libraries. In Patinggalawang's case, he is a ruler, so of course the library that he established is a royal library. But similarly, there are private libraries in Bijapur, Gujarat, Hyderabad, and many other places. For example, in Chennai, in Tamil Nadu, there is a library that is rarely used, but has some of 4 family libraries are put together, private libraries are put together, and continue to survive. But in the larger context, the what we can identify, in this intermixtures of the, or the confluence of the different writing cultures and knowledge systems. Many of those invaluable libraries have been long lost, such as the the Makassari one. And then the question is like, what sort of books, in some of like, sorry, yeah, in these places, Bijapur, Gujarat, Hyderabad, Zanzibar, Java, Mombasa, Aceh, all these places, while some of the libraries did survive, while we cannot identify other libraries, how can we reconstruct the kind of cultures behind these libraries? So what sort of books did they produce, collect, read, and circulate? And what were the norms and practices behind the production and circulation of manuscripts and libraries? And religion itself, to what extent that played a role in the knowledge production and collection itself. So in order to address this question, of course, in the libraries that have survived, even though from later period, for example, the Hyderabad Salarjung Museum Library is one of the rich collections, right? So for the places which were not that lucky to survive, we can still, I suggest that we can still identify uh, the kind of library that must have existed in an oceanic context. And in order to do that, I suggest this idea or this technique of endoscopic analysis of a leaf. If at least one manuscript has survived from the region, we can do sort of like a close study of that manuscript, and with a close reading, a deep reading of its references and intertextual references, we can reimagine, or we can imagine the kind of library that must have existed behind that work. So from that large story, I try to zoom in into one small port town in the southwest India, in Malabar, in Kerala, called Ponnani. So in Ponnani, there was like I have a manuscript that is produced from written in this place in the 16th century. So this text is, again, as I was mentioning, is a commentary on a text that is originally produced in the Middle East, also in the 16th century itself. So the text is called Fathul Mu'in, and the author is called Ahmad Zainuddin al-Malaybari. So Ahmad Zainuddin is well known among South Asian historians, especially early modern historians, as an author of a text called Tuhfat al-Mujahideen. Tuhfat al-Mujahideen is, or Gift of Warriors, is a text that is written against the Portuguese intrusions on the Malabar coast. So as Portuguese were attacking different rulers in the different rulers and communities in the place, he wrote a text asking everyone to support the local king, that is the Zamorin, against the Portuguese. So his text before here, he incited everyone to do jihad or war against the Portuguese under the banner of the Zamorans. He gave a detailed account of the region, Malabar. So, and many people say that it is one of the earliest historical accounts of Kerala or Malabar. So he is known among historians, early modern historians, as an author of this text. But among the those who are interested in Islamic law, he is known as the author of this particular text, Fathul Mu'in. Fathul Mu'in is a text written in Malabar in the 1570s. And as a commentary on another text, which is even more is another commentary. So basically, we can identify this as a auto commentary or super commentary on the text. And the text, immediately after its production or after its lettering, it became sort of well celebrated in the Islamic educational and legal circles from South Asia to East Asia, as well as South Africa to East Africa and the Middle East. And it continues to be taught, studied, printed, translated, and commented upon in South Africa and Tanzania to Singapore, Indonesia, and all these places. and at least 30 or more than 30 commentaries on this Malabari text from different places, and even more translations in, let's say, Bahasa Indonesia and Bahasa Guineas and so forth have survived. So this is an interesting text locally produced in the region in the 16th century. And what would have been, or what could have been the world behind, or what must have been the library that enabled this person to produce a text that would communicate to both local audience as well as a wider trans-regional audience. So in the beginning of the text, he says that, maybe I'll give you a minute to read. Uh, I mean, it may not mean anything. Just that he sort of gives the kind of references that he had used to write the book, and there he says that he depended this book on the, or sorry, he referred to the works of his own teacher called Shihabuddin Ahmad ibn Hajar al-Haytami, uh, who is one of the contemporaries. He died in 1566, so at least around 5 years before the book was published. Oh, sorry, printed. Not even printed, but written. And then, so this is an Egyptian scholar who had migrated to, the first scholar is the one who migrated from Egypt to Mecca. And with Vim and Zainuddin, our Malabari author, arguably studied with Ibn Hajar al-Haytami during his career in Mecca. And the second scholar, Abdurrahman bin Ziyad, is a Yemeni scholar. So again, our author, because he identifies them as our teacher or our teachers, there's a typo. He also possibly studied with them in Yemen. And the other two teachers who are, the other two scholars who are mentioned, they are the teachers of the first two scholars. So Ibn Hajar al-Haytami's teacher is Zakaria al-Ansari, and Abdurrahman bin Ziyad's teacher is Al-Musjad. And then, the sort of tradition goes back to a little bit earlier into 13th century to two other scholars, Al-Nawawi and Al-Rafi. And what is interesting in this text is that in this passage is, of course, like only a small portion of a large, an extensive text. But throughout the text, he refers to the different texts, different works written by these authors, whether Ibn Hajar al-Haytami or Abdurrahman bin Ziyad, Zakaria al-Ansari. Some of their works have survived down to us, while, like, for example, Al-Musjad, his work, very few works have survived, whereas in the work, he must have had access. Our Kerala author, or Malabari author, had access to the manuscripts produced at just a few years or a few decades before him. And along with them, he also refers, in the text, he refers to several other scholars. Some of them, these names include Al-Ghazali, one of the most famous classical scholars of medieval Islam, and many others. And also he refers to his own works, so like a sort of self-citation, right? He refers to some of his own works, and his other works I mentioned Tuhfat al-Mujahideen, but to which, interestingly, he doesn't refer at all, which could lead to a controversy of different sort. I'll leave it for another time. But his texts include, Fatawa al-Hindiya and Ajibat al-Ajiba. And, the other two texts that he at least recurrently refers to, Irshad al-Ibad ila Sabil al-Rashad, which covers a number of different legal and ethical issues. And another text, Hikam on marital laws. So to these texts he refers recurrently, while Ajibat al-Ajiba, which is also a very interesting text that would, uh, explicate the sort of scholarly networks that he was depending in order to write his book. So he doesn't refer to the text in its title or with its title, but he takes several excerpts from the kind of answers that he had or the fatwas he had received from his teachers. All right. So from this, I'll some of the quick concluding remarks. The citation regime in the text helps us infer the kind of library that must have existed in a small port town like Ponnani. And Ponnani was not in any way exceptional. It was part of the larger oceanic world. If a remote satellite port like Ponnani could access this much, like or a person from this place could access this many number of different books, and, similar places or similar port towns could also uh, receive and establish similar number of books. And what this gives is like potentials or analytical and explorative potentials for us to explore the kind of an Indian Ocean Library. And it is, of course, a very bold statement to say this is on the basis of the one manuscript that we can imagine an Indian Ocean Library. But it gives, and we also have to be cautious with the fact that not only cautious, but also being attentive to the fact that, of course, Fathul Moraine is a legal text, and therefore the kind of text that it refers are primarily legal in nature. But also he refers to other ethical and all sort of different materials. If we can locate a couple of other texts from the same context, from the same place or time, we can possibly build up a large, more comprehensive view of an Indian Ocean Library. But still, nevertheless, the text and the author gives us a fine example of how a local scholar could participate in such a broad network that supplied him tools to address both his local audience as well as a wider Arabic-speaking world. And finally, an endoscopic reading of this citation regime of commandarial manuscripts reveals the lost libraries that the authors must have had access in the pre-modern world. With this, I'll conclude, and if there are questions, I can take them. Yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mahmood. We'll just see the chat box. As of now, there are no names, but I hope there are more questions coming up or comments or any sort of queries that you have for the speaker. You can put your names in the chat box and we can unmute and speak and ask also, right? So by the time the questions come up, I was just thinking that probably I'll start with the discussion. Couple of things that I was wondering is once, you were talking about the manuscripts here, and also the libraries here, in the sense of private libraries as well as the libraries patronized by the person who is affluent here, be it a king or be it somebody more in an affluent position here, right? So I was thinking about the audience here, right? Towards the end, you were talking about the Arabic speaking world, but when we come to the local context, like Bonani, for example, or other private libraries in Chennai, for example, that you mentioned, what would have been the sort of audience like? Who would have been the kind of people who had access to these libraries? Or who would have been the people who had access to these manuscripts? Because we're also talking about spreading of ideas, spreading of ideologies and cultures as well, right? Alongside with knowledge, alongside with probably ideas of religion as well. So when ideas and culture have to spread, what about the audience? Do we get more of information about the kind of audience who had an access to these manuscripts?
Yeah, definitely. That's a very important and interesting question. Uh, we often, like, for the pre-modern period, we, especially in South Asian history, we sort of underestimate the kind of a role that the written text played, right? We often emphasize or give more importance for the performative nature or the oratory nature of the text. Definitely, many of the texts were written for a performative function, and some genres were particularly for that purpose. But still, on the basis of the kind of texts that were circulated in the places, the scholarly, at least what we can see from the kind of text that was circulated, they were for a scholarly audience. So scholars depended on this text, and then they were scholars of various nature. They could be, full-time scholars, as the this author was, and they could be teachers. They could be traders, as in the case of Asaf Khan. They could be nobles. They could be it is difficult to get a comprehensive sense of what the audience must have been, but privileged audience definitely had access to many of these collections. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the manuscripts were very expensive, so not necessarily everyone could access them, but still people could and did access some of, and the kind of locations in which these libraries were established. Beyond the royal collections, like in the place like Ponani, for example, there wasn't any royal uh, household. It was sort of a second capital to the local ruler, the Zamorans. But the kind of library that Zainuddin was depending was not part of the royal library. So people, rather it was part of, let's say, private collections, as well as the mosque libraries or the church libraries and similar natures. So people could access them without much restrictions. And people were educated, especially, and that was the advantage of the, at least among the Islamic communities, the importance of the Arabic script, right? You don't have to this script you sort of, like, grow up with, and then eventually you become accustomed to it, and then whatever number of different texts that might come to you, you will be able to read them. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Do we have any other queries, questions, points of discussion?
Will we wait for the questions? I'll get back to this picture that I showed, but I didn't talk about it.
Sure.
Yeah. So this one, I don't know if anyone in the audience would read Arabic. It is something like a photo, a very recent photo came from the Berlin metro, where it says that, like, basically on the nature of the Arabic script, right? Arabic script became, like, often it terrorized people in the last, or it continues to terrorize people for various obvious reasons. So in this bag, it is written, like, I don't know. Okay, so it says that, like, there is no purpose in this script or in this writing except to terrorize people, those who are afraid of the script itself.
Yeah, thank you, Mahmood. I think it's very important for us to understand that even in the pre-modern times, the textual traditions are so rich, right? Most of the time, what happens is that we're not really used to a discussion, or we are not yet open to the entire arena of or the area that we are talking about here. So the manuscripts, the textual traditions is something that we are yet to more familiarized with, right? So I had another yeah, so we have a question here.
Okay.
Ankita, would you like to unmute and ask the question?
Otherwise, I can I
Yeah.
I,
So
I can read that. So
yes. All right. Yeah. Sure.
yeah. So the question is like, whether there are non-fiction or plays or stories or poetry as such. Definitely there were, and this is something like the something that is missing in the South Asian context is that, especially Arabic as a language, and the manuscript collections that have survived from these places have not been properly or systematically studied or cataloged. And like if you look at like major collections in Europe, such as the British Library or the National Library in France, many of those collections, Arabic collections, come, or a large chunk of their Arabic collections come from South Asia. And in South Asia, they continue to be neglected. And therefore, the kind of diversity of the materials included in these collections are not necessarily known to us. Despite of that, recently there have been some attempts to digitalize some of these materials, and therefore to catalog them and to study them. And on that basis, we can say that there are definitely the poetry. Definitely, it's very wide across the traditions, whether it's in Bijapur, Gujarat, or Konkan region, or Malabar region. But something like, let's say, drama is very difficult to locate. I haven't seen, sorry, I haven't seen except one drama, for example. But definitely the stories or the qissas are something also quite common from in some of these places. Yeah, but this beyond all this, religious texts definitely play an important role. But in many of the texts in the pre-modern context, the boundary between the disciplines, and that sort of relates to the title of the series itself. The boundaries between the genres were not necessarily visible, and one could write a religious drama or non-fiction. All sort of different categories existed. If not research, at least systematic avenue. Which one I should go first? Maybe Prerna.
Prerna, you are muted.
Yes. Hi, Mahmood. Very nice to see you for a long time. I missed the first part of your lecture. So if if I'm asking something which is probably a repeat, forgive me. But it's just a concern that I've always had. It's a doubt that I've always had, and I wanted to pick your brain on it as well. That what do you think and how do you tackle it? Like, so for instance, first off, if you're looking at any kind of manuscripts or any kind of availability of sources in Arabic, especially, so are there also oral traditions that are largely used in the creation of those narratives? And if there are, first you let me know if there are any oral traditions as such. But the other aspect that I've also been very concerned about, and this is not just for Arabic, it's for any kind of minor traditions or traditions that haven't been looked into in too much detail, is that we all come with biases. I mean, even the bag that you were just showing and the kind of things that are written in it, or biases against a language, biases against a culture, and sometimes those biases also sort of create a situation where we only pick on certain kinds of narratives over the other. And I myself can never see my own bias. I can only see it in others. So this is a big paradigm within which all historians or maybe everybody functions, that we can never really be completely objective, but there is always these biases to worry about. Then oral traditions that are lost, or maybe even the ones that we are picking on, is based on my bias, that because of my this bias I'm picking on this oral traditions and not those. Maybe I didn't even see those. So as somebody who's trying to work on this and record this, how do you work around these challenges? I mean, how do you try to navigate your narratives to try and be as inclusive as possible, at the same time realizing that it is probably very difficult really to do so? How do you do that? And maybe I'll pick some things from you and try and include it in my own research as well.
No, I mean, this is a very sort of like a challenging task as students of history we always face. So instead of addressing that on the basis of what I just presented, I'll address it with another research that I have been doing on this matrilineal Muslim communities, right, in the Indian Ocean world. And the reason why I mention it is primarily because when we study women and I was talking about the manuscripts, and in these manuscripts it's always very difficult to locate the narratives about the women. And once I study the matrilineal communities, the narratives of women in these materials are almost hard to find, despite the kind of plethora of sources that we have on some of this. Interestingly, the play that I was signposting while answering the previous question is about a woman, who sort of defeats all the scholars in the 9th century Baghdad. But besides that, or beyond that, we do not have a lot of narratives. So one way I sort of, try to go beyond, or try to fill this gap as a student of history interested in the, question of gender in these places, is to combine it with ethnographic research, right? So archival research complemented with the ethnographic research, and I try to communicate with as many as men and women as possible, to see. And sometimes, like, the archives, or the kind of gaps that you feel in the archives are filled from the conversations that you would have with your interlocutors, and vice versa. The kind of silences in their conversations are filled with the kind of materials that you would get from the archives, or from the collections. And once we usually go to a manuscript collection or manuscript library, there is also this usual tendency to look at the written text alone, right? But the larger emotions, or the larger settings or sentiments around the manuscripts, and with, like, or the paratexts, beyond the text, are also something that sort of communicate to us. So I try to pay attention to some of these things whenever the materials themselves are silent. And therefore, the oral tradition. Oral tradition, of course, there are some of these things that we identify as oral tradition, right? Some sort of songs, folk songs, or oral myths and traditions that we identify as oral tradition. But beyond that, there are also the hybrid sort of materials, where a piece of paper that is not necessarily identified as part of any manuscript collection, but still a scribble by a person who, from a distant past, possibly making the only mark in history, could also be something that tell us on the kind of emotions or the or the voice that the person wanted to communicate with us. So what I usually do, like especially in this current project that I have been doing for a period before 1800, it is very difficult to get this sort of voices, right? The marginalized voices. And in order to do that, in order to get that kind of voices, I try to uh, get to all sort of different possibilities.
I
Yeah.
know it's kind of reminding me the last time we all met, we were still like just starting out our PhD research. I think at that time, just finishing MA and things like that. And I think it's the problem we faced even then. You know, we've been taught the objectivity of history, and then we realize it's really very very subjective, and you constantly have to look for these details. So it's
Definitely.
important to have your focus. Where are you moving towards?
Yeah,
Thank
definitely.
you, thank you.
Totally agree. Yes.
Thank you. We have two more questions in the chat box, one by Satavisha and one by Anish. So, shall I read out the questions for you or?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So Satavisha asks, I wanted to know, since you mentioned about travelers' impact on the text, could you probably elucidate the role of trade relations here? If so, in what way?
First and foremost, in this, thank you for the question, Sadavisha. First and foremost, like we had to identify the books as commodities, right? Of course, there were sources of knowledge and everything, but book or particularly manuscript was a very precious commodity. And Ibn Hajar al-Haythami, the scholar that the Kerala author refers to, he sort of like in his account, in his sort of autobiographical writing, he cries out loud that a thief stole his manuscript while he was a student, and he is sort of like writing this in such a sad voice after almost 40 years, such after sorry, later in his career, so late in his career. So the manuscripts were definitely very precious commodities, and therefore the traders often depended on the manuscripts, or like they were engaging, and also in the oceanic context, because the manuscripts were very difficult to move across large borders. They were even more expensive. So Sholmo Goitem, who had written on the base of the Judeo-Arabic materials, he talks about this kind of some Jewish families who were specializing in book trade between in the context of Mediterranean mainly. So between North Africa and Southern Europe in 11th and 12th centuries. So definitely there were like mercantile aspect to it, and there were families or communities who were specializing in book trade as it is today.
Thank you. We have another question by Anish. My question is in regards to storytelling. What were the efforts to preserve stories of the time in these manuscripts? Have any of these stories carried on to modern times?
Uh, yeah, also thank you, Anish, for the question. Uh, Definitely, there are some of these stories. So one of the contemporaries of the same scholar that I mentioned, he one of his stories written in in Arabic script, but the poem, story slash poem, or the story poem is written in early 17th century, and that has survived, and it continues to be narrated and orated and you know s- uh, recited by people, and it is a sort of a panegyric uh, of a 13th century, sorry, 12th century Sufi mystic, a Sufi scholar. So similarly, that kind of stories have survived from different places, and this is just one case of the from the Malabar, but from all sort of different places, like let's say the Babat tradition in the Javanese, we have extensive materials of the puppet shows, for example, puppet stories or puppet show stories, along with the along with the manuscript and the illustrations, extensively illustrated and ornamented manuscripts have survived. And it depends on which place and region that you are looking at. Definitely, the stories have survived in various forms in various places. Although they are comparatively less once we compare to modern period, but still they are in their own nature extensive.
Okay, thank you again. We have one more question by Junaid. Junaid, would you like to unmute and ask the question?
Hello, hi. Hi, Mahmood.
Hi.
So I have one question which regards to the text and the caste making within the text, or like how it manifests in social and so on. So the question is it right to presume that sites of these scholarly discussions around these texts could have acted beyond just being institutions, probably manifesting religious authorities controlling land and occupations, enslavement, etc. And how far do you think these texts could have tangibly altered various systems present in the region prior to their arrival? And what I'm asking is do you see certain tendency of hierarchy or caste making within Islam in these pre-modern textual movements?
So caste in itself, like in the context of Indian Ocean, for a mobile community, like caste often functions in a sedentary group, right? Whereas a mobile, like a highly mobile community, to what extent a caste could or the hierarchies could function is a question that we need to all explore. And I mean, on the basis of my limited knowledge, not necessarily, the caste itself or the, reflections on the caste in a text, for example, a legal text. And often legal texts try to imagine a very sort of egalitarian world, right? An ideal world without elevations. That is there on one side, but definitely there are other texts, like I refer to the other text, right? Tuhfatul Mujahideen, which sort of gives a overview, historical overview of the region. Definitely gives the, and it is possibly one of the earliest accounts of the caste system in Kerala. So you have these two sort of contrasts. On one side, a text that by the same author, a text that aims for a universal egalitarian, worldview in its contents. Whereas on the other hand, you have the text, you have another text by the same author who sort of like gives much more nuanced and hierarchized society. So the text in itself may not level any hierarchy, although it might aim for leveling that kind of hierarchy, but still they it is debatable, or it is difficult to answer that whether the text themselves had direct impact on creating any hierarchy or eradicating any hierarchy, whether of caste, religion, and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you once again for the question and answer. Are there any more questions, any more points of discussion? Okay, so there's one more question here by Dhruv. Dhruv, would you like to unmute and ask the question?
Yes, ma'am. Good evening, ma'am, and good evening, sir. Sir, my question was, were there any more like scholars like Al-Burini? We have heard about his name like throughout our 12th class history. And I am confused with this travel literature. Like I have heard about this term many times. So I wanted you to know what kind of things come under it. And just like Al-Buruni, were there any more scholars at that time who traveled throughout India and other countries in the Indian Ocean, sir?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Dhruv, for the question. Definitely, there were several scholars and travelers before and after Al-Biruni who had traveled across the Indian Ocean. And so it depends on which time we are talking about. For example, at least for the Arabic kind of materials that I have been mostly referring to, there are scholars like Al-Masudi in the 10th century who had traveled between Eastern Africa to India and further, and many more. There is one Suleiman the merchant who had traveled between Persia, India, and China. And afterwards, of course, the most notorious or most well-known Ibn Battuta from 14th century after Al-Biruni, and then Abdul Razak, and many more. There are, many and then once we come to 16th and 17th century, the travel literature explodes, right? With several European, Persian, Arabian, Malay, Chinese authors. And for Chinese authors, of course, they come much earlier as well, right? Way before the Islamic sort of world. The Buddhist travel accounts of the early historic as well as early medieval to late medieval period are extensive. So there are, in a nutshell, there are a lot of these scholars and travelers who had traveled across the Indian Ocean in these periods and had written extensively. Yeah.
Thank you once again. So that would be the last question for our session today. So let me take this opportunity to thank Mahmood. Thank you so much for agreeing to be part of Mezzaterra, taking out time and engaging us with a very wonderful session today, and also a very beautiful discussion as well. So thank you once again, Mahmood, from Team Mezzaterra, and all of us present here. And thank you, audience, for being part of Mezzaterra today. So once again, thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Anna and Prerna. So good to see you both.
Same here.
Let's keep in touch. Yeah. We'll keep in touch.
Sure. Very nice to see you.
Likewise.
Yeah, we can stop the recording, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.